Welcome back to Inclusive Design 24, brought to you in partnership with Barclays Access, the Paciello Group, Intopia, Microsoft Edge, and Open Access Technologies. Don't forget, you can subscribe to Inclusive Design 24 on YouTube by visiting youtube.com/Inclusive Design 24 and hitting the subscribe button. Also, don't forget to follow us on Twitter at ID24Conf. And if you have questions for the presenters, tweet them using the ID24 hashtag, and we'll ask them at the end of the session. We are being joined right now by ID24U Amherst in University of Massachusetts, WEB Dubois Library. I hope you enjoy the show, and we'll start this session. Over to you, Russ.
Next up, we have Alastair Campbell, and he's going to be talking about WCAG 2.1, what's new, and what to do about it. So over to you, Alastair.
Thank you very much, and sorry for the slight delay, everyone. Just Wi-Fi issues. We'll get straight in. So what I was going to cover today was a quick introduction. I assume everyone's pretty familiar with accessibility, but just to make sure we're on the same page, talk through where the guidelines came from, a little history, a little bit about what actually is a guideline in this context. Before moving on to the what's new, we had a new publication this year, so that will be the sort of main focus, and then a bit on what to do with them. So as an organization, do you just sit down and read them? Do you just assume they're going to work, or do you need to do more stuff to get them integrated into your process? You probably know the answer, but this is more of the how-to. So just as a quick introduction to me, I'm Director of Accessibility in Mensa, and fairly recently became co-chair of W3C's Accessibility Guidelines Working Group, who work on the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. So to sort of introduce accessibility in digital projects in this context, I tend to define digital accessibility as how easily people with disabilities can use a particular technology. So it really is a form of usability. But in this case, the technology that people are using might be adapted, used, or understood in a different way than you might be used to. And the platform standards aspects really help to define who's responsible for what. So rather than every website having to sort of discover things and implement accessibility in their own way, it means the platform standards help you understand what you as a site owner, web designer, web developer are responsible for. Because some of it is the responsibility of the user or their technology, but there are core things that designers and developers need to take responsibility for. And they also tend to help in terms of creating a baseline, and they're often used by governments to inform policy and laws, such as procurement laws as well. So when we talk about platform standards on the web, we have HTML, CSS, JavaScript. There are also platform standards for native platforms like Android, Windows, iOS, etc. There are lots of different ways to create websites and web apps. So the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines are sort of somewhat separated from the technology or the technology specifications, and they aim to define known barriers for people with disabilities. And they do try and cross technology as well. Their scope is web content, but it does tend to be a sort of distillation of known issues that can apply across platforms. Now, although the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines might be sort of fairly well known, and it's actually less than 30 pages printed out. Generally, when I go and do training on client sites, I ask how many people have read WCAG, and it's not very many, slightly depressingly. But I also don't start with the guidelines when I'm running that sort of training. And that's because of the results I tend to see when people do start with the guidelines. They tend to use it as a sort of checklist. They wait till the end of a project. They'll look back over their work. They'll look at the guidelines, and strange things can happen. Now, this video probably won't come out great, so I'll give it a little audio description. Imagine you're in a wheelchair, following directions, you get to this lovely accessible door, you press a button. the button's in reach for somebody in a wheelchair, the door is automatic, the door opens, and on the other side, we have stairs. It's not a great experience, and it's probably wasted money from that point of view as well. So when people start learning about accessibility using the guidelines, the results tend to leave something to be desired, and that's mostly because people are leaving it too late. And on your first project where you try and do this, it's very painful, and then you go through a process of trying to pull accessibility further up the process. In fact, when I ask teams where in their process they could use the guidelines in terms of defining how things are going to work, the answers are usually very early in the process. It's basically wherever you can first sketch or prototype things. And this is assuming that you're starting from scratch without a style guide or a pattern library. For most organizations, they're not starting from scratch. You probably have a current website, possibly brand and design guidelines, possibly even code libraries, or at least some default starting points for your development. From working with developers, it seems fairly rare for people to just sit down with a blank screen and start typing things in. You're usually starting from somewhere. So one of the goals I would sort of really recommend for organizations is to build accessibility into their default resources. And that way you take an accessible by default approach for any, especially standard features, things you tend to reuse. So that does lead us to the sort of how. How do we work out the accessibility of things? I am assuming we don't just kind of read guidelines and make a massive leap in understanding. So there are several methods. In terms of testing, there are kind of two groups. There are lots of different methodologies, but there's two groupings of these methods. There's testing with people, and there's testing with rules. And within that, there's a couple of sort of subtypes. So testing for people with disabilities is really useful for testing live websites, apps. It's a little bit more complex than standard usability testing when you include the sort of various technologies that people use. But it is really good for prioritizing issues, learning how people use things, getting buy-in from stakeholders. When you see how people struggle and you realize that that struggle is usually needless, it's very persuasive. However, on the other hand, it's quite difficult to cover much of a website or application if it's fairly large or complex. And it also means you need a sort of reasonably finished product to test with, which means you have to leave it quite late in the process. Testing with guidelines means sitting down and looking at a page. On screen, I've got a little subset of what are actually WCAG guidelines, but translated and made specific for an organization. It can be sped up with certain tools, but it is essentially a manual process. Otherwise, you'll miss things. And it also means you need a reasonable level of knowledge about web development and accessibility to get good results. It is fairly good for coverage in terms of if you pick a set of pages which have a variety of components on and you can get sort of good coverage of those components, you can usually scale that out to the sort of whole website and solve problems systematically. And then automated testing is great for wide coverage of a site, especially if you can integrate it with your process. But it isn't so great for kind of depth of coverage in terms of finding all the issues. And no automated tool can tell you that you've met the guidelines. So I try and sort of create a visual of that, and I have a circular Venn diagram sort of thing going on with big circle for usability. And these issues affect everyone, and often people with disabilities are hit harder by those issues. And then partly within usability, but partly out of usability, you have known barriers for people with accessibility issues, or accessibility needs, sorry. And then as a subset within accessibility, we have the reliably testable accessibility issues. So these are things that two different experts could sit down and test a site and agree that those are accessibility issues. And then as a relatively small subset of that, you have automated testing. And it's worth saying these guidelines actually come from how people use technology. They're not sort of just invented. The guidelines come from sort of experts who work with people with disabilities, people who have disabilities, and usability testing and surveys and research. And it's the automated tools and semi-automated tools use the same guidelines in general. So I keep referring to the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, often pronounced WCAG, but there are other variants, and I'm not going to bring anyone up on how they pronounce it because it's a strange acronym. But where did they come from? They come from the World Wide Web Consortium. Some people will be very familiar, other people less so, but that was started, I think, in the 90s by Tim Berners-Lee. And I would describe it as shepherding web standards like HTML and CSS, but also the accessibility guidelines, because right from the start, the vision was that this is for everyone. The W3C is a membership organization with some big companies like Google, Microsoft, Apple, but also specialist organizations like Momentum and TPG. And back in the early days of the web, there were no accessibility guidelines, and governments and policymakers wanted a method to assess accessibility. And there was a real danger that different governments and areas of the world would have different accessibility guidelines. So the W3C started working on this problem. And to focus on the content guidelines, they became more important because testing with the user agents became so difficult. If you think of typical browsers that people use, you've got 4, 5, 6 browsers that you might cover. But then consider people having a different experience going through different access technologies. We have a plethora of possible user agents, and they all work in different ways. I'm showing on screen about sort of dozen icons from the more popular assistive technologies. And many of these also work together, which makes a really difficult testing matrix. So we need some kind of abstraction layer, a way to ensure that the website is doing its bits without spending all its time doing testing. The W3C looks at the whole ecosystem. The end user has a browser or other means of accessing the website, and designers and developers can create things with authoring tools. But it's really there are different guidelines for those, but we're going to focus on the content guidelines, what the website should do. When starting off, there's lots of sources of issues, but they do get filtered. These issues kind of start off as user requirements, like somebody with X disability needs to be able to achieve this thing. And these are transformed into a content requirement. But it is really worth highlighting what gets left out in that process. A lot of user requirements didn't make it because they couldn't be applied across all types of website. Difference between a government website and one of my favorite examples is a physics journal. There are certain content aspects that you really would struggle to apply across both. Perhaps some things are more difficult to test reliably. If they become too subjective, these guidelines couldn't be used in a legal context. Not to say they aren't subjective, but there's a sort of level of subjectivity that is kind of allowed. And things which dictate the visual display of the website either couldn't be integrated into the guidelines, or they would sometimes get sort of pushed down to a lower level of the guidelines. And there also need to be feasible solutions. So if the author is going to be responsible for something, if the person creating the website has to do it, there needs to be a way of doing that. And sometimes there are gaps in the technology. So certain user requirements can't at this time be met in a kind of feasible manner. So you do have to realize there are probably requirements not covered by WCAG that may well be relevant for your website. In terms of what is a content guideline, as I said, they often start off as user requirements. And if we were taking a screen reader user, one of the most sort of key, important and basic ones is that you could navigate by headings and lists when appropriate. Unfortunately, that doesn't work very well as a guideline because it requires you to know what a user can do, what their technology can do. It tends to be HTML specific. Some technologies don't necessarily have headings. And it means you have to decide on what's appropriate. It's not integrated with the guideline. So that's often why the guidelines come through as more difficult to understand, but they become more feasible to actually achieve. So on screen, I've got an unworkable guideline I've labeled. Users can navigate by headings and lists when appropriate. The more difficult to understand but works example is that information, structure, and relationships conveyed through presentation can be programmatically determined or are available in text. So I do fully admit that is harder to understand, but it's a lot easier to test. And also it's more stable. If new markup gets added to HTML, we don't need to update the guidelines. So when you get to the guidelines, as I hope you will at some stage, they're organized. And there are 4 principles: perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. And within those 4 principles are 13 guidelines. And when we talk about guidelines, these are actually only categories. There's nothing you apply through the guidelines. It's just a way of grouping them. So when we do talk about guidelines, what we usually mean is the success criteria. So these are the true or false statements about the web content. And I fully admit that I will switch between using success criteria and guidelines without thinking about it. It is worth just quickly covering the levels that are within the guidelines. So you may have heard of, A, AA, AAA level of accessibility. There's no officially defined rule for what is in which category. But level A is generally considered to be critical. Some people will not be able to access the content if that does not pass. AA tends to be also essential, but there may be workarounds. So, for example, if you didn't have headings in a page, you could still get through the content. It's just harder to navigate. And then AAA may well be essential to some, but they might be difficult to do or infeasible in practice. They might not apply to all types of content, or they might require a change to the look and feel. So there's kind of positives and negatives. It's not a hard and fast rule. When you look through, the actual guidelines themselves are, I think, less than 30 pages printed out, at least the guidelines section. But each one does have a lot more content behind it. So each success criteria has an understanding document, and I do strongly recommend that as your first port of call if you're not sure what it's about. And each criteria has multiple techniques. So a technique is a way of achieving that thing. You can have sufficient ones. Advisory techniques are sort of you can use but won't necessarily mean you pass. And there are also some failure techniques, which are examples where you definitely fail. So when you look at the guidelines, I've just snipped out one success criteria on the page, and the understanding link is, in my opinion, the most important link to anyone who is new to the guidelines. Follow that, and you should find a reasonably understandable page describing what it's supposed to do. So that's the overview. What's new? Well, after almost 10 years, when WCAG 2 was originally written, probably mostly written in 2006, touchscreens weren't a consideration back then. It wasn't an immediate problem, but after about 2010, touchscreens were becoming much more mainstream, and also things like JavaScript frameworks, single-page applications had become much more common, which have their own concerns. And there are also some notable gaps for people with cognitive or low vision. And looking back in history a little bit, there have been several major changes that have caused big concerns for people with accessibility requirements. For example, in the beginning, there was the command line, and there were screen readers for it. But when the GUI, the graphical user interface, was popularized in the 90s, people with screen readers were really worried, because how would these things cope with this non-text interface? But standards for the applications were invented and methods were found of making them accessible. We had a similar sort of thing with the phone development. So when the iPhone was introduced, it was another kind of uh-oh moment, because things which worked with a keyboard would not be available. So I remember I have friends who would use a Nokia with its keys and install a screen reader, and it was pretty clunky, but it worked. But then Apple introduced a touch interface-based screen reader, and actually the iPhone's pretty highly regarded from an accessibility point of view, and Android's getting pretty good these days as well. In future, we have other interfaces on the horizon. Things like VR, where at the moment it seems very kind of required that you would have full mobility and full vision. But I think input-output independence is a fairly well-established principle, so I'm fairly confident we can avoid some pitfalls and keep the guidelines moving and up to date. So coming back to Earth a bit in terms of timelines, the accessibility guidelines evolved in the last year, but that was quite a long process. So it did start in around 2013 with 3 task forces. The first public working draft was at the beginning of last year, beginning of February 2017, and then it got through to sort of candidate recommendation, and then the official publication was in June of this year. And of the over 60 proposals originally, 17 new success criteria made it in. So let's have a look through the new ones. The ones coming primarily from the mobile task force started off as mobile and touch screens, but actually incorporated voice input as well. So a couple of these new criteria are actually aimed at things like Dragon Naturally Speaking, which is a voice input program. So orientation is the first one, which is really just predicated on the knowledge that some people can't turn their phone around. This gentleman called Todd, who I saw in an Apple keynote, is in a wheelchair, and on his stand he's got a couple of devices. I think one's an iPhone, and they are clamped in place. He simply cannot change orientation. So one of the new guidelines is to say, don't restrict the orientation. Unless it's essential. There is a caveat. There are some things where you would need to restrict the orientation, but in general, for most websites, just don't. Another one is character key shortcuts. So this is one that's aimed very much at voice input, where if a site implements keyboard shortcuts, that can really interfere with voice input. So for example, I've got a little scenario on screen where a Dragon user sits in front of the Gmail, their friend Kim walks in, he looks up, hey Kim, and then Dragon picks up Y, archives the current message, K moves down one, M mutes the message or thread. Bob looks back at the screen and doesn't really understand what's going on. So it can cause real issues for people. So the idea is that you either don't do that, or if you do incorporate custom keyboard shortcuts, so that is you're developing them, then let people turn them off or remap them. Things like, if you add a control or another modifier key, that doesn't affect it, so those are okay. But it's very much the sort of single character keys like J, K for next and previous, those sorts of keys that are impacted. Pointer gestures are, so essentially there is one aimed at people using touchscreen devices with assistive technology, such as a screen reader. So the criteria is that all functionality that uses those kind of gestures like swipe left and swipe right can be operated with a single pointer without a path. So this is essentially saying, don't rely on swipe gestures. please include buttons or another means of doing it. And on screen, I've got an example I snipped from the BBC website where they have a carousel, so you can swipe back and forth on that carousel, but they also have buttons kind of hovering in the corner as well. So it allows multiple ways of doing it, which is all it's asking for. Pointer cancellation is another one, which is essentially don't activate things as soon as the person touches the screen or clicks on an event. Normal events, lots of people don't notice, but when you actually click on a link, nothing happens until you release the click. And it's the same when you're tapping things. So I come across this quite often if you're scrolling through a page on a mobile device, and as you're scrolling through, an advert activates. And that's because it activates as soon as you touch instead of waiting for you to release. So that's an issue for people with mobility impairments. And actually, I'm very grateful that this guideline is in place. It is another argument against using those kind of adverts. Another one aimed at voice input is label and name. So somebody who's looking at a screen and might say to Dragon, click send button or click button send. It's really important that the visual is available to Dragon. And the way that happens is through something called the accessible name. And that accessible name is something that should match the visuals, but can be overridden. So I've got an example on screen. So there's a good example-ish from Google where we're looking at the pagination, and it's got just the number 9 visible, but it's got an ARIA label of page 9. So the 9 is included, so that passes. We've got a failure case as well, where there's a button that visually says send, but it has an ARIA label of submit, which would override the visible label. So somebody saying click button send, nothing would happen because that's not what it's called to Dragon. There's another one that's basically don't rely on motion sensors in order to activate functionality. It's perfectly fine to use motion sensors to activate functionality as long as you don't rely on that. So one example is the undo delete function that you get in the Mail app on an iPhone, and you can kind of shake the phone and it will say, oh, do you want to undo that? And it brings up a dialog. That's perfectly fine because there are other ways of achieving the same thing. And then at a AAA level, there's a target size criteria where we're looking for things that you tap or click to be at least 44 by 44 CSS pixels. There are a few caveats though. So if there's another link to the same thing that is big enough, or if the target is in a sentence or a block of text, or it's not under the control of the author, or there's an essential exception, those are things which don't have to be at least that size. And this was quite a tricky one. It's a shame we couldn't get a bit further with it. The problems were, and I'll just show a screenshot from Wikipedia where I sort of applied that sizing, and it does odd things to main navigations and sort of other links. And there's a lot of different edge cases where it doesn't necessarily bring benefit, but it does make the interface more difficult to do, and it quite heavily impacts the look and feel of the website. And we couldn't find a good way of saying this only applies on mobile devices. So that was the mobile criteria. We also have some low vision criteria where these are aimed at people who have some vision, but it's sort of impacted in some way. So I'll go through and have a look at Reflow. So this is basically trying to enable as much zoom ability as possible within web content. And to make it testable, we couldn't say zoom in to 400% because we don't know what size window people have to start with. So what we did is define the size it should be able to zoom to which is effectively 320 CSS pixels, which happens to line up with a sort of standard small mobile touchscreen size. And for internationalization, some people might use horizontally scrolling pages instead of vertically scrolling pages, so there is an equivalent height for that as well. There are some things which are accepted, such as two-dimensional tables, things like images. You can't, break an image in half and just reflow that. So there's a few exceptions, but in general, we're looking for pages to be able to zoom in. As a quick demo, I think the Boston Globe was one of the first responsive sites that I was aware of. So what you will see if I zoom in, right up to 400%, and what we're looking for is that no content or functionality is missing, and that we don't get horizontal scrolling. So I've got no horizontal scroll bar. This all seems to be working fine. So that is the kind of thing we're looking for. It is worth mentioning, I would need to check the menu, check that matches up on the smaller site, that sort of thing. Not everything has to be in the page in the same way, but it just has to be available. So another one is adaptable text. That's kind of my name. The text spacing is the official sort of name for that one, where we assume that people can override the text spacing, text sizing on different elements. What we're asking authors to do is to check that up to a certain point, that doesn't break things. So line height, letter and word spacing, and spacing following paragraphs, there is a sort of set amount for each of those that we are recommending to test to. What this enables is for people not just to use these values, but maybe to change the fonts on the website. Different fonts have different kind of natural sizes. So if somebody prefers Comic Sans, for some reason, comes up quite a lot, that tends to take up more space than Arial. So what we're looking for is a bit of buffer around space. And combining three different success criteria, I tend to test them in one go. So from WCAG 2.0, we have the text sizing criteria. Text needs to be able to get to at least 200% bigger. We now have this zoom and reflow criteria, and we have this text spacing criteria. So I tend to do it all in one go. Open up a browser, set it to 1280 pixels wide. I use the Web Developer toolbar for that. Zoom in to 400%. Check the same functionality is available. Check that text is at least 200% bigger. Then I apply the text spacing styles and gradually zoom out. And as I do that, I check for kind of overlapping and unreadable text. So just to give a quick example of that, let's open up GovUK, which I will then zoom in. So GovUK, it's fairly plain, but it does have sort of images, columns, and plenty of content. Zoom into 400%. Just check that the same things are available. Then I would use a tool called text spacing, which is basically a bookmarklet. It just applies extra spacing to words, letters, and paragraphs, and line height. Just check that everything's still here and doesn't overlap too much. Apologies for the scrolling. When you zoom in, you have to scroll quite a lot. That might be considered an easy example. So I also have a less good example to open up. I kind of like their products, but not so keen on the website. I'll just point out, if we look at the main navigation and we have monitors, peripherals, networking, cables, and deals on the right, if I apply text spacing, we lose the right-hand side of the navigation. It doesn't wrap, it doesn't scroll. There's just simply no means of getting to it. So they haven't really accounted for this kind of buffer around text. And also, when we zoom in, we basically have massive horizontal scrolling, which is really painful to use, and even a sticky header that basically means we have a tiny, tiny window to look through, which makes the whole site really difficult to use. Another of the sort of, I think, of bigger new ones, partly because it took a lot of work to get to the final draft, and partly because it's something we do find comes up a lot when we're doing accessibility audits. It's non-text contrast. And there are two areas, 2 bullet points, where one area is user interface components, so that's links, buttons, and form controls, and their states. And the other aspect is graphical objects, which are required for understanding, which is a very key word that I'll come on to. Looking at the user interface components first, what we're looking for is that the design aspect which conveys that it is a button or control has contrast. So that doesn't mean everything. For example, on the left is an example button, which is just the text button. There's no line, there's no background, there's nothing. But it is required to have a visible focus style and for that to have contrast. So the focused version of that button has a sort of thick grey line around it. And input styles as well. There are various ways you can do it. So the top example is just has a grey sort of bottom border on the input and a very light grey, not contrasting background. And that's okay if it's that bottom line that is the thing that's conveying it's an input. That is what needs to have the contrast. The next example has a sort of the blue outline showing that it's focused. And the last example is basically a pure white box with no border, but because it's set on a dark background, that has sufficient contrast. So the user interface components tends to be fairly straightforward unless you're getting onto sliders and things. The graphical objects takes a little bit of explanation, and I've got an example I did from GitHub site, which I use far too much, but it has lots of small graphics in it, so it makes quite a good example. And if I highlight all the graphics, we have quite a few, but in the scope of the success criteria, we don't need to look at all of them. So first of all, I'm going to ignore the essential ones. So that's a brand logo or a picture of real life kind of falls under the essential exception. So people's pictures, we don't want to change the contrast of people's faces just to make them stand out because that turns it into something else. We can also ignore all the ones which are not required for understanding. So any of these little icons which has text next to it are not required for understanding, as long as the text has contrast. So we're left with, I think, about half a dozen which are required for understanding. They're things you need to click on, they have no text associated, and they're not representing something from the real world. So if I then drill in and do a contrast check on all of those, we find most of them pass apart from a white arrow on a green background. But that is quite a small subset of all the available graphics on a page. So please don't panic in terms of absolutely every graphic having to have 3:1 contrast. It's also worth remembering to check different variations of a page. So quite often people, or websites rather, will drop the text next to an icon at smaller screen sizes. So do check the smaller screen sizes because more icons or graphics might come into scope. There's another new success criteria called content on hover or focus, which basically says that any content which is triggered by a hover or focus event has to meet certain criteria. And one of those that they tend not to meet is the dismissible one. So if you hover over something, you should be able to get rid of it without moving your mouse pointer. And that's because people using magnifiers or zooming in quite heavily may not be able to move their mouse without moving their entire view of the page around. And One example, which in other respects is a fairly well put together site, is John Lewis. But when you mouse over their main navigation, it basically fills the page depending on your screen size. So it's actually very difficult to get rid of. If you click on the triggering element, it takes you to another page, so that doesn't help. So if you move over the element, over the new content, this massive menu, obviously that has to stay there, but it does make it rather difficult to get around, especially if you think that you might be zoomed in. So getting around this whole thing is really difficult. If a site like that implements the escape key, so press escape to dismiss the content, that solves that problem. And then we have 3 criteria that came in from a cognitive accessibility point of view. Identify input purpose in a couple of ways, and timeouts. Sorry, because I was slightly late starting. I'm just conscious of time. So this started out as a personalization one, but basically the bits that were feasible right now were to use the Autocomplete attribute. So where you have a form that you're confident will be filled in by the user with their own information, if you use the Autocomplete attributes, it can help people automatically fill it in. So on screen, I've got an example contact form. My browser, actually LastPass, has several sort of options available to me. I click on my name for the first one, and it fills in all my details. The idea is that this could progress further in future with more of a personalization angle, where, taking this very, very plain demo, you would be able to sort of apply your personalization, and it might reduce the options, simplify the color scheme, and add icons to things. And then timeouts was one aimed at people who might have to sort of leave the computer, come back to fill things in, and it's essentially to warn people if they might lose data during a process. So I've got a screenshot from I think another GovUK screenshot where at the beginning of a process it says, if you stop part way for more than 20 minutes, your data may be lost. So the success criteria is basically either save the data or warn people that it might be lost. And then we had 2 other sort of miscellaneous criteria. Animation from interactions and status messages. So the animation from interactions was for the benefit of people with vestibular disorders, where things like parallax, which is where you scroll down a page and things move at different speeds, can trigger some quite severe symptoms like migraines or nausea. There are certain websites, I've talked to somebody who said after using that website, I had to sit down for 3 hours, or lie down, in fact, for 3 hours. It is a thing a little bit like epilepsy, where it's triggered by some stimulus, and then you get the effects, and there's not a lot you can do about it as the person, apart from avoid them, avoid the triggers. So I have to give a trigger warning to this next example, because it is possibly the most extreme example of a vestibular trigger I could find. So if you do suffer from this, please look away for about 30 seconds. So I'm going to click this. It also makes the fans on my laptop go. So this site loads, and as soon as I start scrolling, the entire page flips over and new images come through. So there's already a criteria around animation that automatically happens, which this site also does. But what we are filling in a little gap in is that it applies when users do something like scrolling. So I'm going to close that before it makes my fans whir. And it's worth noting there is a media query that will find out somebody's preference. So as a user in certain browsers like Safari, you can say, I don't want, I'd prefer reduced motion. And then as a web developer, you can hook into that and put your animations behind that media query. And the last new one is status updates, which is essentially to make sure that anything which is a status update away from where the keyboard focus is provided programmatically. And in general, at the moment, that means adding something like ARIA Live to status messages. The example on screen is a demo from a WCAG character counter. So as you're typing in, it has ARIA Live set onto the status message, and it will tell you how many characters you have remaining. Fairly straightforward, but one to keep an eye out for. So the last couple of minutes, what should we do about these?
I'm afraid, Alastair, we're going to have to cut you off. We need to wrap up, I'm afraid. But thank you for stepping in and doing this under difficult circumstances. I think there might be some questions on Twitter. If you wouldn't mind taking a look at the hashtag there and maybe answering a few of them, that would be.
Yeah, I'll do that in the next few minutes, and I will point people to some more resources.
Great, thank you. So if you like this session, hit the like button and subscribe to Inclusive Design 24 on YouTube. It is sponsored by Barclays Access, the Paciella Group, Intopia, Microsoft Edge, and Open Access Technologies, with thanks to our sponsors, DQ Systems. We will be back in literally a few minutes with David Henke-Reed talking about elegant accessibility. Thanks again.